Welcome Year 11, this is a revision session for you on Language Paper 1 question 5. So that's the creative writing question that comes at the end of the language paper after you've done the 4 questions based on the extract that you have read. The reason this question is really important is because it's worth an awful lot of marks, so do make sure you leave ample time for it. I would suggest leaving at least 40 minutes, probably 45 minutes for it. You could start with this question if you wanted and then go on to the reading questions, it's up to you. So there's 24 marks for content, so that's to do with the style of your writing, how well it's organised, how well it fits the brief. There's also 16 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar for your technical accuracy. So it's important to spend a lot of time checking your work. So that's 40 marks overall. That means it's 50% of the paper. And overall, this question is 25% of your language GCSE grade. So it's definitely worth taking the time to make sure you feel really confident with this question. And here's a breakdown of the mark scheme, what's being looked for by the examiner. So those 24 marks for content include good communication. Is what you're writing about clear? Does it match the purpose, form and audience? So the purpose is usually to entertain for this creative writing in the form of a descriptive piece or a narrative. And the audience, I suppose, ultimately is the examiner, but also would it be interesting to people your own age as well as adults? Good vocabulary, so making sure you're using ambitious words. Even if you're not a confident speller, good vocabulary, you'll notice, is in both this section and in the SPAG section of the mark scheme. So it's going to give you more marks even if you can't spell the word correctly, so it's always worth having a go. Language devices, so showing off your writing skills with metaphors and similes. Make sure ideas are connected, including across paragraphs with clear connectives between paragraphs. So it all flows together, it makes sense. And then structural features. We'll come back to that a bit later on, explaining what those mean, but you should be used to them now by answering question 3. So kind of how are you enticing the reader, engaging the reader in what you're writing. SPAG's fairly straightforward, so sentence demarcation, have you got capital letters, full stops accurately? A range of punctuation, so also trying to use different types of punctuation. And again, we'll come back to this, things like the semicolon. A range of sentences, so starting with different words, but also some short, some long and more complex. Your grammar should be good and your language formal. So no using words that you sort of use, slang words that you use in the playground. It should be formal and well structured, clear. Obviously good spelling, ideally. And again, there's the good vocabulary again. So you can see you're marked twice for it. So definitely worth bearing in mind. So I've talked about how vocabulary is sort of double marked, so definitely worth investing in. So I'd suggest getting together a vocabulary bank, learning some words that can be used in a multitude of situations that will be impressive to the examiner. So I've got some here for us to use in this revision session. So the vocabulary is down the left, and on the right I've either got a definition of that word or another word that means the same thing. So for example, immense could be used in the same way that you would use massive. So do take some time to copy those down, think about how you would use them, and obviously understanding the definitions and how to use them correctly. And then we'll try and use them in our writing in this session. So ambitious punctuation is one thing that gains you marks. So I'm going to give you a few examples that you can use in your writing. So here we have 2 sentences that are separated clearly with a full stop and a capital letter in the middle, but they're quite closely linked. The fact that the street is sombre is partly to do with the old and decrepit houses on the street. So 2 sentences like this that are closely linked, you can actually join with a semicolon. So as you can see, I've put it in here. Do remember, after a semicolon, you don't need a capital letter. So the T on the goes to lowercase. So that's an easy thing to do that will gain you mark. Assure the examiner that you know a range of punctuation that you can use. We can also include brackets, so where we want to put a bit of extra information in the sentence, rather than just using commas, we could use brackets to again show a range of punctuation. Finally, we could also use end dashes, which you can use in a similar way to brackets or commas, but again, it just shows the examiner that you know a range of punctuation that you can use it accurately. The mark scheme also talks about a range of sentences, varied sentences. So here we have a paragraph with a few little sentences, but they all start in a very similar way. So he walked down the sombre street. He was surrounded by decrepit houses. He was looking for a lucid escape route. Then he heard a whining noise. Then he noticed a minute alleyway. He went down it and then he saw a terribus figure. So a lot of repetition of he, quite short basic sentences, overuse of the word then as well, which is quite common when you're trying to tell a story. So here's a way to kind of join some of those sentences together, put the information together, and also start some sentences with different types of words. So we start here with the verb, walking down the sombre street, surrounded by decrepit houses. He looked for a lucid escape route, and we've also used commas there to include extra information. Then starting with an ly word, an adverb. Distantly, a whining noise began. He noticed it was coming from down a minute alleyway. A tenebrous figure lurked ahead of him. It was impossible to make out its face. Trapped. So again, I've used a semicolon there, I've used brackets. So it's the same information, but it's just varied in the way it's presented. One way to remember this, you could write on your plan, on your exam sheet, is ed ing ly, trying to start sentences with ed words, ing words and ly words, as I've highlighted on the screen there. So the question itself is always going to ask you to describe or narrate. Describe, very straightforward, just a description, often based on a picture or a prompt. Narrate suggests a story. But I would argue that even if you're asked to tell a story, that you'd focus on the description. You shouldn't have lots of action, lots of things happening, and you should avoid speech. So here on this screen, we've got an image that we're going to look at. Some of you might recognise it from the women in black. So we've got a figure in the foreground. So you could write in first person as if you're that figure, or you could write a more general description of the scene. And obviously in the back we have this really creepy house that can be part of the description. A good way to start a description is to use our senses. So to look at the image and think, what can we see? If we were there, what would we hear? Is there anything that we can smell if we were in this place? Touch, what could we feel if we reached out, if we touched the things around us? It might be there are things to taste. But even if there's nothing in terms of food or drink, you might still taste something on the air. And then also our feelings. How do we feel in the situation, or how do the people in the scene feel? So I want you to take a moment to write a table similar to this one. So you've got your 5 senses and then feelings as well. I'm going to put up the image again, and I want you to spend some time filling it in. You might also want to try and use some of the vocabulary that we had at the start of the session. So I've filled in some examples in the table for you and included some of that vocabulary from the beginning. So we can see decrepit windows in the house. We can hear whining wind and sonorous waves. We can smell the rancid undergrowth of the sort of bushes and grass. If we reach out, we can touch the damp, rusty gates. We might be able to taste salt air. And the feelings of the character or ourselves going into the picture are trepidation or maybe despondency. And one good way, I think, when you're faced with these images, particularly if you don't think they're very exciting images or you've got a prompt for something, is to imagine a movie running in your mind of the scene. And it always says inspired by or based on, so you can extend outside of the picture, you can add extra detail. So I've got a video here for you to watch, which is a clip from The Woman in Black that sort of ends, well, halfway through is this image of him looking at the house, and then he also enters the house. What I'd like you to do then is watch the video, but with the table in front of you. And you could watch the video and pause it at several points and add to those senses and the feelings of how you would feel if you were the main character. So riding on the cart towards it, going across the causeway, across the sort of swampy marshes, into the island, and then up towards the house and finally into the house. So add as much detail to that table as you can. Okay, here are some examples for you. Hopefully you've added lots more to your list because it was quite a long clip. But I've added some ideas here in terms of the senses and the feeling of the character as they walk through them. As well as vocabulary, we talked about using devices. So you might want to think of some specific devices that you might want to use. So like a metaphor, a simile where we use as or like to compare something. Personification, so giving human emotions to something inanimate, an object within the picture or within the idea. A triplet, so 3 phrases or words to add emphasis. A noun phrase simply means adding adjectives before your noun, and this is where your vocabulary might come in. So rather than just talking about the house, you can call in ancient decrepit house. Rather than just talking about the sky, you can talk about the murky, tenebrous skies. And finally, repetition. So repeating a phrase or a word for effect. So here we get the idea of looking out the window, searching and searching and searching, looking for something, sort of building up tension. Now in the exam, you wouldn't necessarily have time to do all of those notes to come up with all of those ideas, but you should spend at least 5 minutes planning, and that's where you might scribble down some of these ideas. I'd suggest 2 approaches to planning. You might have others. I tend to put it in terms of paragraphs, but obviously some paragraphs might be as short as 1 word and some may be very long and detailed. So rather than thinking of it as paragraphs, you might think about it as ideas. So one option here is you could kind of map out the story or the journey. So we could have a paragraph on his journey out towards the house, a paragraph on his first impressions arriving at the island, then one on seeing the house, one on inside the house, and then maybe one where he's in the house in the window looking back at the way he's come. An alternative might be to use the senses that we've done and use them as paragraphs each. This is particularly good if you've not got a story, if you've not kind of got a journey, but you've just got a moment. Like if we just had the image, we might want to just describe how we would feel and what we could see in that moment looking at the house. Right at the beginning, we looked at structure on the mark scheme. So there are various ways to include structure in your answer. So you could include a flashback. So in this scene, you might start with him at the house and entering the house, and you might have a short flashback of a paragraph describing why he's at the house or his journey to get there. You could have a circular structure where you start with a certain phrase or idea or description, and then you end with that same sentence or phrase or description. They're really easy ways to highlight to the examiner that you've used structure for effect. So quite simple things that you can do every time you write to ensure that. Structure is also about varied paragraphs. So think about when you answer question 3 on the language paper, you talk about the focus shifting. You talk about having a wide view, zooming in on some detail. So that could be another way that you show a confident use of structure by varying the focus of your paragraphs, maybe introducing new characters or talking about setting and then talking about character. So I talked at the beginning about how important this question is and the time that you allow for it. So in the exam, as I said, you should spend at least 5 minutes planning your ideas, scribbling down perhaps some vocabulary that you might want to use, some devices you want to use, and thinking about what you're going to write in each paragraph or each section. It's tempting just to start writing, but the problem with that is you might write a fabulous paragraph or a couple of fabulous ideas and then run out of things to write about. So by spending that time writing, it means you're not going to get stuck after a few minutes. But once you've planned, I would suggest spending at least 30 minutes writing. And it's about quality, not quantity. So the examiner doesn't want to see pages and pages and pages. So you do need to think as you write about what you're writing, but it needs to be fairly substantial to gain the marks. Even if it's a narrative, don't think about covering too much action. Description is the key. That's where you're including all the vocabulary. That's where you're able to use all your devices. So try and think about, like we've done today, just taking a short scene or even just one image or moment and describing that in lots of detail. Definitely avoid dialogue, avoid using speech. The problem with that is it's quite hard to punctuate. Students often make mistakes punctuating it, which then means a drop in spag marks. And also there tends to be little description and few language devices in speech, so it doesn't tend to add anything to your work. So if you're telling a story, you might want to use a little bit, but I would avoid it if you can. You also need to allow time for editing or checking at the end. So I would suggest at least 5 minutes at the end before the exam finishes or before you need to move on to a different question. And here's that mark scheme again. So you would go back through your work, check for any silly mistakes, any punctuation or grammar that you can correct, but also can you edit it to include better punctuation if you've missed it? Could you add in any extra words? Could you draw a star and add in an extra paragraph or some extra detail? Could you work on the structure by adding a little bit at the end to create a circular structure? Just spending that time making sure there's no silly mistakes and you haven't missed any opportunities to gain marks. As with all things, practicing is key. I'm sure you've done plenty of practice papers in lessons, and also potentially you've been finding them off the internet or you've been collecting actual papers from Miss Swanborough's classroom. But it's a really good idea with this question because it's worth so many marks to keep persevering. There's several things that you can do to help you. So reading good examples is a lovely way to improve your own writing. If you don't want to read whole novels, you could just go on Amazon and click the Look Inside button and read some openings that will probably be descriptive or give you ideas of how to start a piece of writing. Also, the extracts that we use in the reading section of paper 1 for the first 4 questions, they often contain good descriptions or examples of good writing that you could kind of pinch ideas from or look at for examples. Just like we've done today, you could take photographs or even short clips of movies to watch and then practice writing a description or a short story based on them. I can't stress enough, work on your vocabulary. I've given you a small bank of words here. You could just add a few to that. Words that you could use no matter whether the description is a positive scene or a negative scene, no matter what's happening in it. I'm not talking hundreds of words, but even just learning 20 ambitious words like we did today and being able to use them in several situations could gain you a lot of marks. Most importantly of all, keep going. Hopefully what I've talked you through today has been really useful. Do think about writing these examples and handing them into your teachers to be marked. Even if you don't want to do a whole paper 1, if you know your writing is a weakness or needs work, then you could write up question 5, like the example we've done today, and let them have a look at it and give you some feedback on where to go next. I hope that's been helpful. If you've got any questions on this session or want more help or more ideas, do email me. Thanks very much.